silence began not as an absence of sound, but as a void in the soul of mankind. In the Empyrean, where the thoughts and dreams of quadrillions coalesced into a roiling, living sea, a dead calm began to spread. It was a cancer of nothingness, a patch of psychic placidity that was more terrifying to the navigators and astropaths of the Imperium than any warp storm. Storms were rage, storms were life, however malignant. This was a profound and spreading emptiness. It began at the edge of the Lyra sector, a prosperous and populous collection of worlds deep within the Segmentum Pacificus. First one system, then 3, then a dozen, simply ceased to contribute to the great psychic choir of the galaxy. Their light in the warp was extinguished, not with a scream of cataclysm, but with the silent snuffing of a candle flame. Lord Inquisitor Valerius Corda of the Ordo Xenos felt the cold dread of this phenomenon long before the first official reports reached his obsidian fortress spire on Hydrafor. He was a man whose soul had been worn thin by 3 centuries of confronting the alien, the heretical, and the unknowable. His face was a mask of stern lines and old scars, his remaining eye a cold blue orb that missed nothing, the other replaced by an augmetic that glowed with the soft, analytical light of the machine cult. He had seen Tyranid hive fleets blot out the stars, and Necron legions rise from slumbering worlds, yet the data slates piling up on his strategium table described a horror of a more insidious nature. There were no distress calls, no desperate pleas for aid, no garbled accounts of invasion or rebellion. The tithe ships from the outer Lyran worlds were simply overdue. Vox communication channels, when hailed, returned only open carrier static. The sector's administrative center on Lyra Magna, a hive world of staggering population density, continued to transmit automated compliance data, its numbers and figures painting a picture of perfect, uninterrupted order. It was this perfection that was so utterly wrong. There was no fluctuation, no margin of error, no minor shortfalls or surpluses that were the hallmarks of any human enterprise. The data was a flat line of impossible efficiency. The first visual evidence came from the Explorator vessel Omnissiah's Gaze, a lone Mechanicus probe ship that had been charting gravitational anomalies on the sector's fringe. It diverted course to the agri-world of Viridia Thrai, a planet that had fallen into the spreading silence weeks prior. Its report was brief and chilling. The picked captures it transmitted showed cities and farm sprawls completely intact. There was no sign of destruction, no fires, no bodies. But the people were wrong. In the sprawling plazas of the capital, thousands upon thousands of citizens stood shoulder to shoulder, motionless. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply stood, heads tilted slightly upwards, as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. In the fields, laborers stood idle beside their harvesting machines, their tools lying where they had been dropped. The picked log showed the sun setting and rising, the shadows lengthening and shrinking, and the crowds never dispersed. They were statues of flesh, a world of living monuments to an unknown god. Corda watched the picked feed on a hollow projector the size of a wall. The image zoomed in on a woman's face. Her eyes were open, but they were vacant, like polished glass. A thin trickle of dust had settled on her unblinking lashes. She was breathing. The probe's bioscanners confirmed it. The entire population was alive, their hearts beating, their lungs drawing air, but they were gone. Whatever had made them human, The spark of consciousness, the soul, had been scooped out, leaving only the shell. More reports, more fragments painted the same picture across a dozen worlds. A mining outpost on a barren moon, its workers standing in perfect formation in the thin atmosphere, their void suit helmets all facing the same direction. A naval station in high orbit, its crew at their posts, hands resting on controls, their gazes fixed on the void beyond the armored glass. They were puppets waiting for a puppeteer. Corda felt a cold dread unlike any he had ever known. This was not the brutal, straightforward slaughter of the orcs, nor the ravenous consumption of the Tyranids. This was a violation, an act of theft on a scale so vast it was almost incomprehensible. It was an extermination of the soul itself. He stood before the hollow projector, the cold light of the augmetic eye casting long shadows in the cavernous room. He cross-referenced the spread of the silence with known Xenos incursions, warp phenomena, and heretical cult activities. There were no matches. The silence spread faster than any known fleet could travel, yet it was not instantaneous, suggesting a contagion rather than a single psychic event. It was silent, methodical, and utterly absolute. He gave it a name then, a designation for the reams of data and the unspeakable horror they contained. The Silent Scourge. Lord Admiral Devorn is 3 weeks out from Lyra Magna with Battle Group Omega, his aide, Interrogator Hex, stated, his voice a low monotone that did little to conceal his own unease. Her orders are to render aid and re-establish contact. Corda turned away from the ghostly image of the silent crowds. Her fleet is sailing into a tomb, Hex, or worse, a trap laid with the bodies of 10 billion loyal Imperial citizens. He tapped a command rune on his console, and a new directive began to form, encrypted with the highest inquisitorial ciphers. This is not a mission of relief. It is an inquest into the murder of a sector. The instruments of this inquest will not be scribes and interrogators. They will be warships and legions. He authorized the mobilization of every asset under his direct command. He sent encrypted summons to the Iron Hands chapter fortress on Medusa. Their cold and unforgiving logic, a necessary tool against a foe that preyed on empathy. He dispatched a request to the Fabricator General of Mars himself, demanding the aid of their most radical magi biologists, for this was a plague of a kind never before seen. The Lyra sector was lost. He knew that with a certainty that chilled his very bones. The question now was whether the contagion could be contained, or if this silent, soulless tide would wash over the galaxy, leaving an imperium of empty, breathing corpses in its wake. The war against the Silent Scourge had begun, and the first shot had been fired without a sound. The warp tore open with a nauseating lurch, disgorging the colossal form of the Emperor-class battleship, the Triumph of Sol. It was the heart of Battle Group Omega, a vessel of such immense scale that it was a moving city of adamantium and faith, its spires and gun batteries scraping the void like the talons of a vengeful god. In its wake, a fleet of cruisers, destroyers, and frigates materialized, their plasma drives burning a defiant blue against the blackness. At the heart of this steel armada, on the command deck of the Triumph, stood Lord Admiral Syra Devorn. She was a woman carved from the same unforgiving material as her ship, her face framed by iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, her uniform crisp and laden with the honors of 100 campaigns. Her gaze was fixed on the planet swimming into view, Lyra Magna. From this distance, the sector capital was a jewel, a sphere of swirling white clouds, deep blue oceans and continents ablaze with the lights of 1,000,000,000,000 souls. The colossal hive cities were visible even from orbit, titanic spires that clawed their way through the atmosphere, testament to the unyielding industry of the Imperium. A web of orbital stations, defense platforms, and commercial docks glittered round the planet like a diamond necklace. It looked peaceful. It looked prosperous. It looked exactly as the Administratum records described it, but the silence was a physical pressure against the ship's auspex arrays. "All channels remain silent, Lord Admiral," reported the Master of Communications, his face pale in the glow of his console. "Automated shipping transponders are active, but there is no response to our hails. Not from the planetary governor, not from the orbital command, not even from the astropathic choir. It is as if the entire system is holding its breath." Devorn's fingers tightened on the armrest of her command throne. This was not the chaotic chatter of a world under siege, nor the desperate fragmented calls of a populace ravaged by plague. It was a complete and total void. Her orders were to re-establish contact and render aid, predicated on the assumption of a communications breakdown or a localized disaster. This felt wrong. It felt calculated. "Magos Varric, what do your scanners see?" she commanded, her voice cutting through the tense quiet of the bridge. The red-robed tech priest at the Master Auspex terminal turned, his metallic features impassive. "Life signs are nominal, Lord Admiral. In fact, they are abnormally stable. Population density in all major hives is at 100%. No atmospheric taints, no abnormal energy signatures. Power grids are fully operational across the planet. The defense laser network is fully charged and tracking, but on standby." His voice, a dry, synthesized rasp, added, "It is a world operating at peak theoretical efficiency. It is, illogical." A shiver of unease traced its way down Devorn's spine. A world of trillion souls could not be perfectly efficient. There was always chaos, always imperfection. It was the nature of man. "They may be under a shroud of some kind, a psychic damper," suggested Fleet Commodore Valerius, her second in command. "Perhaps they cannot hear us." "Perhaps," Devorn conceded, though she did not believe it. "But we will proceed by the book until the book is proven wanting. Commodore, dispatch the first wave, the 77th Elysian drop troops. Have them secure the primary spire's main spaceport at Hive Primus. I want boots on the ground and an answer to this silence within the hour." The order was given. From the cavernous launch bays of the fleet's cruisers, squadrons of Valkyrie assault carriers detached, sleek angular shapes that dove towards the planet's upper atmosphere. Devorn watched their progress on the main hololith, their tactical runes glowing a reassuring green as they began their descent. They sliced through the wispy outer clouds, streaking towards the needle-like peak of Hive Primus. Everything was proceeding as planned. And then, in a single, silent, coordinated instant, hell was unleashed. Every single weapon in the Lyran system fired at once. The entire orbital defense grid, a network of platforms and weapon stations that had been designed to repel a chaos fleet, turned its myriad guns upon Battle Group Omega. Lances of pure energy, the width of frigates, stabbed out from the planet's surface. Torrents of macro cannon shells, each the size of a hab block, filled the void. Clouds of missiles, thousands upon thousands of them, erupted from hidden silos on Lyra Magna's moon. It was not a panicked volley. It was a single, perfectly timed alpha strike of unimaginable ferocity. There was no staggered fire, no overlapping fields of engagement. Every gun fired at the optimal target at the optimal moment, a symphony of destruction conducted by a single, malevolent will. On the bridge of the Triumph, alarm screamed a cacophony of terror. The ship shuddered as void shields, stressed beyond their limits, flared, buckled, and died. Explosions blossomed across the fleet. The frigate's stalwart blade was vaporized in a crossfire of lance beams. The cruiser Hand of Vengeance was gutted, its spine broken by a wave of torpedoes that had been patiently waiting in dormant orbital mines. All hands brace for impact. Evasive maneuvers, return fire. Devorn roared, her composure cracking for a fraction of a second as her fleet was torn apart. The bridge crew moved with frantic, disciplined haste, but they were reacting to a blow that had already landed. Worse was to come. The picked feeds from the Elysian drop were broadcasting pure horror. As the Valkyries screamed towards the spaceport, the entire hive spire had come alive. Anti-aircraft batteries hidden beneath hab block facades opened up, filling the sky with a storm of flak. But it was what was happening on the landing pads that defied all sanity. The crowds of silent people, the ones Corda had seen in his own intelligence reports, began to move. In perfect unison, millions of men, women, and children turned their heads towards the descending Imperial craft. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like puppets on a string. They swarmed out of the habs and onto the vast landing platforms. They did not carry weapons. They were the weapons. One Valkyrie, its engines trailing smoke, managed a crash landing on the edge of the spaceport. Tempestus scions in their distinctive carapaces poured out, forming a defensive perimeter and opening fire with their hotshot laser guns. The beams tore through the front ranks of the advancing crowd, dropping bodies in heaps. But the crowd did not slow. They did not scream. They did not falter. They did not even flinch. They simply walked forward, a silent, inexorable tide of flesh, climbing over their own dead. The last images the fleet received from the ground were of the scions being overwhelmed. They fired until their power packs were dry, then they fought with combat knives and fists. But for every one civilian they killed, 10 more took their place. The silent masses swarmed over them, a wave of bodies that pulled them down, tore off their helmets, and then, with a chilling, coordinated precision, began to tear them apart with their bare hands. There was no rage on their faces, no hatred. There was nothing, just the blank, placid expressions of obedient dolls. Lord Admiral Devorn watched the picked feed cut to static, her face a mask of cold fury and dawning comprehension. Her fleet was burning. Her elite troops were dead. This was not a rebellion. This was not a world in crisis. Lyra Magna was a weapon, and its entire population was its ammunition. "Recall all surviving vessels," she ordered, her voice low and hard as granite. "Pull back to the Mandeville Point, damage report, and get me a priority 1 astropathic message to Lord Inquisitor Corda. The relief mission is over. We have made contact. The Scourge is not just silent, it is waiting, and it is hungry." Battle Group Omega, battered and bleeding, turned its back on the jewel of Lyra Magna, now revealed as a system-sized death trap. They left behind their dead, and the horrifying certainty that the war for the Lyra sector would be fought not against a Xenos fleet or a demonic legion, but against the very people they had been sent to save. The astropathic message from the Triumph of Soul did not arrive as a clean script of text, but as a psychic scream that burned out the minds of 3 junior astropaths in Corda's own choir. It was a chaotic torrent of terror, grief, and the cold, hard data of catastrophic fleet losses, all layered over the horrifying, silent imagery of a world of puppets turned murderers. Corda stood in the lead line sanctum as his primary astropath, a withered ancient fused into the mechanisms of his choir throne, translated the psychic viscera into coherent thought runes that scrolled across a crystal slate. The Inquisitor read of the perfectly coordinated attack, the sheer impossible weight of firepower, and the final sanity-shredding report from the Elysian drop troops. He felt no surprise, only the grim satisfaction of a man whose worst fears had been confirmed. The silent Scourge was not a passive contagion. It was an actively hostile intelligence of terrifying capability. Within the hour, Corda stood alone in the chamber of proxies, a lightless void deep within the heart of his fortress. Before him, 10 stone thrones sat empty, yet 10 voices, ancient and powerful, spoke directly into his mind. They were the disembodied will of the Senatorum Imperialis, the High Lords of Terra, channeled across the galaxy through a nigh unbreakable psychic link. To them, he presented the evidence, the spreading void, the pics of the silent populace, and now the raw, bleeding report from Battle Group Omega. He did not ask for aid. He laid out the existential nature of the threat and presented his directive as the only logical conclusion. For a long moment that stretched into an eternity, the only reply was a crushing psychic pressure, the weight of 10 immense minds scrutinizing his every thought, every memory, every iota of his being. Then, as one, they gave their assent. The Lyra sector and the 10 surrounding sectors, a swathe of imperial space containing thousands of worlds and quadrillions of souls, were to be placed under the Cordon Imperialis. It was a decree of ultimate quarantine. No vessel would enter, no vessel would leave. Every astropath within the cordon was to be silenced, their choirs either put to the sword or their powers ritually bound to prevent any psychic message from escaping. The region was to be surgically excised from the Imperium, a vast and festering wound cauterized by warships and orbital mines. To oversee this monumental task, the High Lords granted Lord Inquisitor Corda the full authority of a War Master, a title not invoked for millennia. He was given supreme command over all Imperial forces within the Cordon, answerable only to Terra itself. The war was his to win, or to die containing, far across the segmentum, aboard the Iron Hands battle barge, Fist of Iron. The summons was received not as a plea, but as a logic problem of unprecedented scale. Cardan Stronos, the newly appointed Iron Master of the Rockin clan, stood on a command deck that was more factory floor than throne room. There were no gilded aquilas or soaring arches here, only bare unpainted adamantium, thick data conduits, and the rhythmic, percussive clang of machinery from the decks below. Stronos was a giant even for a space marine, his form heavily augmented with gleaming silver bionics. More than half his face was polished steel, his one remaining eye a cold, calculating orb of pale blue. He reviewed Corda's data slate, his expression unchanging. The biological agent severs the anima from the corpus, leaving a compliant organic vessel, Strono stated, his voice a deep, resonant bass with the flat timbre of a Vox synthesizer. The enemy then utilizes these vessels as a coordinated weapon system, a highly efficient method for neutralizing planetary populations and repurposing their infrastructure. He looked up at his Iron Fathers, a council of grim-faced cyborgs. The emotional response, fear, revulsion, is a weakness. This is not a populace to be saved. They are compromised assets, a biological weapon of unknown potential. Our objective is not liberation, it is sterilization. We will analyze the weapon's deployment, identify its weaknesses, and excise it from the sector. All other considerations are sentimental flaws in logic. There were no cheers, no oaths of vengeance, only the cold, unanimous hum of activated power fists as the Iron Fathers signaled their logical accord. The Fist of Iron and the entire Raukean fleet altered their course, their engines burning with cold purpose towards the newly declared war zone. In another sector, aboard the Mechanicus, Logos Unbound, the summons was received with something akin to religious ecstasy. Archmagos Valerius Kane, a towering figure whose original human form was buried beneath a mountain of crimson robes, wearing mechadendrites and arcane devices, watched the data from Lyra Magna on a shimmering datasphere. His multiple optical lenses dilated and contracted with feverish excitement, while others saw horror. Kane saw perfection. Miraculous, he hissed, his synthesized voice filled with reverent static. Observe the synchronicity, 1 trillion individual biological units, all operating as a single processing network under a centralized command. No latency, no rebellion, no flawed emotional responses. It is the motive force made manifest in the flesh, the ultimate union of the organic and the systematic. His laboratory sanctum was a nightmare of blasphemous science, filled with twitching servitors, nutrient vats containing half-formed biological experiments, and data looms weaving patterns of forbidden code. The Inquisition seeks to destroy this marvel, stupidity, blindness. This is not a weapon to be broken, but a holy text to be deciphered, a key to elevating humanity beyond the weakness of the individual will. He issued his own commands. His legion of Scutarii, gene-bulked and mentally shackled to his will, and the full might of the Cygnus Prime fleet would answer the Inquisitor's call. But Kane's mission was not one of purgation, it was one of acquisition. He would journey into the heart of the silent hell, not to destroy it, but to steal its divine fire for himself. And from a throne of living agony, hidden in a pocket dimension of shadow and torment, Archon Melixia Vex watched the Imperium's response. Her realm, the theater of whispers, was not a place of steel and circuitry, but a grand amphitheater carved from weeping, translucent crystal that sang with the captured pain of 1,000 races. She reclined on her throne, a slender figure of lethal grace, her pale skin crisscrossed with delicate, shimmering scars. On the crystalline stage before her, the events at Lyra Magna played out not as tactical displays, but as a grand opera of despair. The burning Imperial ships were her fireworks, the silent swarming crowds, her perfectly choreographed chorus. They send their monsters to fight mine. She whispered to the flayed attendant thing that writhed at her feet, her voice a silken melody. How gloriously predictable. The iron butcher, the metal priest, the shadowy inquisitor, such archetypes. They believe this is a war to be won with logic and fury. A cruel smile played on her lips. They do not understand. This is not a war. It is a performance. And the grand finale will see a galaxy of puppets dancing on the strings of their own extinguished souls, a final silent applause for my masterpiece. She made a delicate gesture with one finger, a command that rippled across the psychic network. In the Lyra sector, another world, a fortress world this time, fell utterly silent, its garrison of 1,000,000 guardsmen turning as one to face the coming Imperial fleet, their laser guns held ready, their faces as placid and empty as the void itself. The overture was over. The first act was about to begin. The strategic linchpin of the Lyran cordon was the forge world of Cygnus Prime. It was not a world of continents and oceans, but a singular planet-spanning factory of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Its surface was a continuous crust of manufactorums, plasma forges, and data cathedrals that climbed miles into a smog-choked, eternally night-like sky. Its orbital space was a dense forest of shipyards, weapon foundries, and research stations, a skeletal web of gantries and docks that glittered with the ceaseless industry of the machine god. Cygnus Prime did not merely supply the sector with arms and ships. It was the anvil upon which the military might of a dozen sectors was forged. To lose it would be to cripple the entire imperial war effort before it had truly begun. Archon Melixia Vex, from her vantage in the theater of whispers, understood this with an artist's appreciation for dramatic structure. To simply bombard the forge world would be a crude and unsatisfying act. Her art demanded more. She sought not to break the machine, but to corrupt it, to turn the very logic and order of the Mechanicus into another instrument in her silent orchestra. Her weapon was not a fleet, but a whisper. A single tainted cargo hauler, its crew long since turned into soulless marionettes, was allowed to be captured by a Skitarii patrol on the system's edge. It was a Trojan horse of exquisite design, its holds filled with seemingly standard STC components, but its every surface and the very air within its recycled atmosphere was laced with a dormant aerosolized strain of the marionette's kiss. The vessel was brought to orbital docking spire Epsilon 7 for standard quarantine and analysis. The Skitarii who boarded it, emotionless and efficient, reported no signs of life or hostile action. They cataloged the cargo, their optical sensors detecting nothing amiss, but as they breathed the filtered air, as their mechadendrites brushed against the tainted bulkheads, the psychophage found its way into their systems. It did not work on them as it did on baseline humans. The Skitarii's heavily augmented biology and shackled consciousness offered a unique challenge. The plague did not sever their souls, for what little soul remained was already bound to the motive force, but instead it subtly overwrote their core programming. The litanies of the Omnissiah were replaced with a new, silent imperative. Loyalty to their magi was supplanted by devotion to the maestra of whispers. The change was instantaneous and undetectable. When the quarantine was lifted, the Skitarii cohort returned to their duties, their binaric cant perfectly in order, their movements as precise as ever. But now they were sleeper agents, nodes in a growing network, spreading the psychophage with every interaction, every shared data wafer, every exhalation of their augmented lungs. The plague spread through the lower, more human echelons of the Forge world first. The teeming masses of menials, servitors and indentured laborers who toiled in the radioactive hells of the underforges fell silent by the tens of thousands. Entire hab levels became quiet zones, their inhabitants standing motionless in the dark, waiting. Magos Khan, aboard his Mechanicus, was already in system when the first signs of discordance appeared. His esoteric sensors, tuned to detect the very frequencies of the soul, registered a growing flatness in the noosphere of Cygnus Prime. He dismissed it as a data anomaly, his focus entirely on preparing his specimen collection teams. Cardan Stronos and the Iron Hands arrived a day later, their warships taking up grim sentinel positions in high orbit. Stronos distrusted the Forge world's apparent calm, his tactical logic screaming that such a high-value target would be the enemy's primary objective. The performance began at the ordained hour. All at once, across the entire planet and its orbiting stations, the infected turned. The menials in the forges did not riot. They simply walked in perfect unison towards the great plasma conduits, their bodies a living dam that caused catastrophic cascading meltdowns. The servitors on the assembly lines continued their work, but began introducing microscopic, fatal flaws into every weapon and shell they produced. The Skitarii, a full third of the planet's standing army, simply turned on their uninfected brethren. The war for Cygnus Prime was a spectacle of surreal horror. It was a war fought in near total silence, a conflict of machines against puppets. Legions of Skitarii, rangers, and vanguards, their allegiance now sworn to a silent mistress, advanced through the metallic corridors of the Forge world. They did not shout battle cries. Their vox emitters broadcast only a low, hissing static. They moved with a fluid, coordinated grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. Every volley of their radium carbines and galvanic rifles fired with the machine's perfect timing to inflict maximum casualties. Against them stood the loyalist Mechanicus forces, equally silent, equally impassive. Tech priest Dominus, leading cohorts of Cataphren battle servitors, engaged their former comrades. The only sounds the percussive thunder of heavy phosphor blasters, the shriek of torsion cannons, and the crunch of metal on metal. It was a war utterly devoid of passion. There was no fear, no hatred, no heroism in the conventional sense. It was a conflict of competing data streams, a brutal equation of attrition being solved in real time with ammunition and flesh. The human element of the war was even more grotesque. Lord Admiral Devorn's surviving naval armsmen, tasked with securing the orbital docks, found themselves facing the civilian population. Station workers, engine seers, and even astropaths advanced upon them, their faces blank, their bodies used as shields by the traitor Skitarii behind them. The guardsmen were forced to fire into the unresisting crowds, their laser gun beams cutting down men and women who simply stared back at them with empty eyes as they died. The psychological toll was immense. Men who had faced orcs and chaos marines broke down, their minds shattering at the sheer wrongness of it all. Into this silent, grinding hell, Cardon, Stronos, and the Iron Hands descended. They made planetfall not as saviors, but as exterminators. Their drop pods and thunderhawks slammed into the traitor-held manufactorums like steel meteors. They wasted no time trying to distinguish between corrupted combatant and enslaved civilian. To Stronos' cold logic, they were all one and the same, components of a hostile weapon system. The Iron Hands advanced in a relentless, implacable wave of black and silver ceramite, their storm bolters and heavy bolters chattering a litany of death. They fired into the silent crowds without hesitation, their auto-senses tagging every biological entity as a threat. They did not see people. They saw corrupted data, a virus that needed to be purged from the system with overwhelming force. The battle for Cygnus Prime had become a war between two armies of automata, with the soul of a forge world as the prize. In the crucible of Cygnus Prime, where the very concept of humanity was being systematically disassembled, Cardon Stronos became a legend. It was not a legend of heroic charges or inspiring last stands, but a grim saga of ruthless, brutal efficiency. He was not a commander who led from a gilded throne miles above the battle. He was the blood-stained tip of the spear, a relentless engine of destruction at the heart of the most savage fighting. To the terrified Imperial Guard commanders who received his laconic commands, and to the beleaguered Mechanicus magi who witnessed his methods, he was not a savior in shining armor. He was the Iron Butcher. Stronos established his primary command center not in the secure bunker, but on the open plaza of Manufactorum Alpha Row 7, a vast expanse of ferrocrete surrounded by towering smelters that still belched black, chemical-laced smoke. The ground was littered with the silent dead, both Scitarii and menials, their bodies arranged in neat sectioned piles by Iron Hands servitors, awaiting Prometheum cleansing. Here, amidst the constant deafening clang of industry and war, Stronos directed the battle. His face, half steel, half stone, was illuminated by the flickering red light of a tactical hololith that displayed the entire planet in stark logical wireframe. He saw the war not as a series of engagements, but as a single complex logic problem. The enemy's greatest strength was its perfect coordination and its utter disregard for self-preservation. They used the enslaved populace as a living shield, a tide of flesh to absorb firepower and clog the gears of the imperial war machine. Any commander burdened by sentiment, by the instinct to preserve innocent life, would be paralyzed. They would hesitate. They would lose. Stronos had no such weakness. The flesh was fallible, a flaw to be corrected or, in this case, purged. His first major directive sent a shock-wave of horror through the Allied command structure. He identified a dozen major underhives, each teeming with millions of enslaved menials that were being used as staging grounds for the puppet armies. Commodore Valerius, now acting as Devorn's ground liaison, argued for surgical strikes for attempts to isolate the traitor Scitarii from the civilians. Stronos dismissed him with a cold stare from his single human eye. "Your logic is flawed," the Iron Master's Vox voice grated. "The civilians are the primary weapon. To preserve them is to preserve the enemy's ammunition. The sentimental calculus is a path to defeat." He ordered the fleet in orbit, what remained of Battle Group Omega, reinforced by the Iron Hand's own formidable vessels, to initiate orbital bombardment. Not with pinpoint lance strikes, but with wide-beam melta charges and mass driver slugs. The targets were not the military assets within the hives, but the geothermal pylons that powered and ventilated them. One by one, the pylons were vaporized from orbit. The result was a silent planetary scale atrocity. Deep beneath the adamantium skin of Cygnus Prime, millions upon millions of the enslaved suffocated in the sudden total darkness, or were flash-cooked as the forges below them went critical. There were no screams for help, no panicked flight. They simply stood in their silent ranks as their world died around them. Stronos watched the life sign indicators for the targeted sectors on his hololith blink from green to red, then to black, his expression as impassive as if he were watching a routine diagnostic. He had eliminated over 100 million enemy assets with less than a dozen torpedoes. To him, the equation was a resounding success. On the surface, his tactics were just as brutal. He did not engage the enemy in grinding, street-to-street fighting. He identified their advance vectors and simply leveled everything in their path. Entire manufactorum districts were brought down with coordinated artillery strikes and Thunderhawk bombing runs. He created fire breaks of molten slag and impassable rubble, funneling the silent armies into kill zones where massed Predator tanks and Vindicator siege guns could obliterate them by the thousand. The Iron Hands did not take prisoners. They did not attempt to find a cure. They simply advanced, their bolters dispensing methodical death, stepping over the bodies of the slain without a second glance. He personally led the assault on the Grand Data Cathedral at the planet's northern pole, a structure that had become the primary nexus for the traitors' silent network. He strode at the head of a phalanx of Gorgon Terminators, their passage marked by the rhythmic, thunderous stomp of ceramite boots. The puppet Skitarii threw themselves at him, their radium carbines spitting green energy that hissed and sparked against his Terminator plate. He did not even bother firing his storm bolter. He simply waded into them, his mighty chain fist, will of Medusa, whining as it tore through torsos and limbs in sprays of oil and blood. He moved with the focused, irresistible force of a tectonic plate, his every action precise, economical, and utterly lethal. His cold fury was a terrifying thing to behold. It was not the hot rage of a berserker, but the chilling, absolute certainty of a machine executing its function. He saw a corrupted Skitarii Dominus directing its forces from a high gantry. Stronos did not issue a challenge or roar a battle cry. He simply raised his arm, and a graviton pulse from his shoulder-mounted cannon tore the gantry from its moorings, sending the Dominus and its entire bodyguard plunging into a river of molten metal below. He became a force of nature within the battle, an avatar of logical, remorseless war. The moniker, the Iron Butcher of Cygnus, was first whispered by a terrified guardsman who had watched Stronos' Terminators cleanse a Hablock by detonating its fusion core. The name spread like wildfire through the Imperial forces. It was a name spoken with a mixture of awe and revulsion. They feared him. They were horrified by his methods, but they could not deny the results. His brutal, inhuman calculus was working. The silent tide was being stemmed. The advance of the puppets was slowing, breaking against the unyielding wall of his remorseless logic. Cardan Stronos was saving Cygnus Prime, but he was doing so by systematically murdering its entire population, sacrificing the soul of the world to save its machine heart. And in the cold depths of his own augmented mind, he saw no contradiction. It was simply the most efficient path to victory. Archon Malixia Vex observed Cardan Stronos' brutalist artistry, not with frustration, but with the keen eye of a connoisseur watching a rival master at work. The Iron Butcher's logic was a hammer, crude and effective, shattering her carefully arranged compositions. He was turning her silent chorus into mere casualties, his atrocities robbing their sacrifice of its poetic horror. A lesser artist would have been enraged. Melixia was inspired. If Stronos wished to reduce this war to a cold equation of force and attrition, she would present him with a variable that his logic could not compute. Her first act had been a subtle infiltration, a masterpiece of insidious corruption. Her second would be a symphony of grand operatic violence. Her command, a psychic note of pure, refined malice, echoed from the theater of whispers into the minds of her hidden collaborators on Cygnus Prime. The homunculi of the Coven of the Unmarred Visage. They had accompanied her cabal not for the promise of plunder, but for the unprecedented artistic opportunity. For weeks, while the silent scourge spread, they had been at work in the deepest, forgotten corpse starch refineries and biorecycling plants of the underhives. Here, amidst mountains of the processed dead and nutrient sludge, they had access to an almost infinite supply of their chosen medium, flesh. Following the Archon's new directive, the puppet populace of Cygnus Prime began to move with a new, horrifying purpose. From the silent, corpse-choked hab levels that Stronos had so ruthlessly quarantined, vast processions of the enslaved began a final, silent pilgrimage. They marched not to the battle lines, but to the hidden laboratories of the homunculi. They walked willingly into the arms of grotesque flesh-crafting engines, their bodies rendered down, stripped, and reshaped by whirring bone saws, chittering metallic claws, and sizzling electrosutures. There was no resistance, no terror. They simply offered themselves up to the Coven's abattoir altars. The Imperial forces first became aware of this new phase of the war when seismic tremors began to rock the foundations of the manufactorums. Deep-range Auspex sweeps registered colossal biological masses coalescing in the planet's subterranean levels. Then they rose, bursting through ferrocrete hundreds of meters thick. They clawed their way to the surface like mythological titans awakening from a millennia-long slumber. They were the chorus golems. Each one was a walking blasphemy, a flesh colossus standing as tall as a Reaver Titan. They were amalgams of tens of thousands of bodies, stitched, fused, and welded together into a singular monstrous form. Legs thick as hab blocks, braided from countless spines and femurs, carried torsos that were pulsating, continent-sized mounds of flesh. Arms like living siege cranes, ending in hands made from hundreds of fused bodies, could pulverize a Lehman Russ tank into a flattened wreck. But their heads were the most hideous feature. They had no single head, but a cluster of thousands of faces, all silent, all with the same vacant staring eyes of the enslaved. And from deep within their composite chests, a low, resonant thrumming could be felt, a psychic vibration that warped the air and caused sane men to weep without knowing why. Stronos watched the first chorus golem rise from the rubble of a district he had personally ordered leveled. It towered over the surrounding structures, its shadow falling across the battlefield like a shroud. Its movements were slow, ponderous, but imbued with an unnatural grace. His logic-driven mind struggled to process the sheer tactical absurdity of the creature. It was a weapon of pure terror, but also one of immense physical power. All batteries concentrate fire on hostile Bio-Titan designation Alpha, he commanded, his voice betraying no emotion. The full might of the Iron Hand's siegecraft was unleashed. Basilisks, medusas, and whirlwinds threw everything they had at the creature. Shells that could crack a fortress wall exploded against its flesh, gouging out craters the size of buildings. But the golem did not seem to register the damage. The wounds oozed a thick, ichorous fluid, but the creature's advance did not falter. The thousands of faces that decorated its form remained placid and unfocused, even as they were torn apart by shrapnel. Then the golem acted. It did not roar. It sang, not with voice but with psychic power, a wave of pure, concentrated will, amplified by the thousands of captured souls bound within its form, washed over the imperial lines. It was the distilled essence of the marionette's kiss, no longer a subtle contagion but a bludgeoning psychic weapon. The iron hands, their minds hardened by decades of psycho-conditioning, felt it as a nauseating pressure, a cold, oily static that tried to worm its way past their defenses. For the mortal crews of the Imperial Guard tanks and artillery, it was devastating. Men seized up at their posts, their eyes glazing over, their hands falling from their controls. Some simply slumped over, their souls snuffed out in an instant. Others began to turn their weapons on their comrades, their movements jerky and puppet-like. The chorus golem was not just a siege engine. It was a psychic amplifier, a mobile synapse for Vex's will. In its presence, her control over the enslaved was absolute, and her silent whisper became a deafening shout that could break even the most disciplined minds. A second, then a third, golem emerged in other sectors of the planetary battlefield, each one a new epicenter for the psychic plague. Stronos realized his error. He had treated the enslaved as ammunition, but he had failed to consider that the enemy could simply reforge that ammunition into a cannon. His strategy of creating fire breaks and kill zones was now useless. These new monstrosities simply walked through his fortifications, their psychic aura, neutralizing the defenders before their physical mass crushed what was left. The tide of the battle, which his brutal logic had so effectively stemmed, was now turning against him with horrifying speed. All units tactical withdrawal to designated fallback points, he ordered, the command tasting like ash in his vocalizer. Reroute auxiliary power to cranial psychic dampeners. Prioritize elimination of the bio-titans. The flesh is resilient. We must break the machine within. He himself moved to intercept the first golem, his personal honor guard of Terminators marching at his side. He was a being of cold, hard logic, facing a creature born of impossible artistic sadism. The war for Cygnus Prime had escalated from a brutal purge to a battle against living gods of flesh, and for the first time in a long and storied career of war, Cardon Stronos felt the cold prickle of an unquantifiable tactical variable: doubt. While Cardon Stronos confronted the chorus golems on the blighted surface of Cygnus Prime, a far more insidious battle was being waged in the cold, sterile confines of the Archmagos, Logos Unbound. Here, in a sanctum shielded by meters of adamantium and crackling energy fields, Magos Valerius Kane watched the war unfold, not as a participant, but as a scholar observing the galaxy's most fascinating dissection. His multiple optical lenses were fixed on a score of data feeds, displaying the biological and psychic outputs of the chorus golems, the mortality rates of the Imperial Guard, and most importantly, the molecular structure of the marionette's kiss. He had succeeded in his primary objective, the acquisition of a live sample, a specialized servo hauler crewed by lobotomized servitors, immune to the plague's psychic component, had retrieved a dozen enslaved menials from a derelict orbital station. Now, in shimmering stasis fields within his laboratory, these silent, placid figures stood as living testaments to the psychophage's genius. Kane saw no horror in their vacant eyes. He saw only the elegant purity of the agent's design. Flawless, he would intone to his assembled apprentice magi, his mechadendrites gesturing excitedly at a holographic representation of the psychophage virus. It does not destroy the host's neural pathways. It does not crudely overwrite their consciousness like a common scrap code infection. No, it performs a perfect microsurgical excision. It locates the very locus of the soul, the so-called spiritus humanis, and simply unplugs it. It leaves the vessel intact, operational, ready for a new, superior pilot. His obsession grew with every passing hour. He saw the marionette's kiss not as a Xenos weapon, but as the Omnissiah's answer to the greatest flaw in creation, the chaotic, rebellious, and inefficient nature of human free will. He imagined legions of Scitarii and armies of Imperial Guardsmen, their fears, doubts, and pathetic loyalties erased, all operating under the singular logical direction of a magos like himself. It would be the ultimate expression of order, the final victory of the machine over the flawed flesh. The Imperium could be perfected, saved from itself by this divine contagion. But the Xenos' control system, the link back to Archon Vex, was an impurity. It was an unnecessary and aesthetically displeasing complication. He, Valerius Kane, would be the one to refine this miracle. He would create a new strain, one that severed the soul, but left the vessel receptive not to a distant alien artist, but to the pure, logical cant of the Adeptus Mechanicus. He would become the master of the silent chorus. His grand and treacherous design required a perfect test subject. A baseline human was too simple, a Scitarii too predictable. He needed a vessel that embodied the pinnacle of human biological engineering, tempered by the most rigid and logical of doctrines. A mind and body already honed into a weapon whose conversion would be the ultimate proof of his theory. He needed a space marine, and not just any space marine, but one from the chapter that most venerated logic and the purity of the machine, an iron hand. His plan was one of audacious, calculated betrayal. The main communications nexus for the Iron Hands war effort was their orbiting fortress monastery, the Iron Spire, a colossal Ramillies-class star fort that bristled with lance batteries and macro cannons. It was the brain of Stronos' operation, coordinating fleet movements and ground assaults. It was also, Kane knew, protected by some of the most powerful psychic shielding in the entire Imperial Armada, a necessary defense against the chorus golem's insidious song. This shield was his primary obstacle. Accessing the Iron Spire's core systems was a simple matter for Archmagos of his standing. Citing the need to integrate the Mechanicus' BattleNet with that of the Astartes for enhanced tactical synergy, his tech priests were granted limited access to the Starfort's cogitator networks. They were wolves in sheep's robes. Kane's chosen agents, fanatical members of his own esoteric subcult, did not plant a virus or a bomb. They planted a back door, a single line of corrupted code disguised as a diagnostic canticle. Then, from the biovats of the Logos Unbound, Kane synthesized his first refined batch of the psychophage. It was a modified strain, keyed not to Vex's psychic frequency, but to a binaric signal that he alone could transmit. It was his leash for the soulless. He loaded the culture into a single specialized torpedo, its warhead replaced with a pressurized dispersal canister. The Iron Hands believe the flesh is weak. Kane broadcast to his disciples as he gave the final command. They seek to replace it with the certainty of steel, a noble if primitive ambition. We shall grant them the next stage of their evolution. We will free them from the final flaw, the ghost of a will that still haunts their machine shells. They will become the first of my new perfect order. At the height of a renewed assault by the chorus golems, when the Iron Spire's energy reserves were focused on its void shields and weapon batteries, Kane enacted his folly. He transmitted the activation code to his backdoor program. For a mere 3.7 seconds, a single, vital energy conduit to the fortress monastery's psychic shielding was rerouted. It was a power flicker so brief it would be dismissed as a minor surge. But it was enough. In that fleeting window of vulnerability, the torpedo, launched from a cloaked Mechanicus scout ship, struck the Iron Spire's hull. There was no explosion, just a soft hiss as the refined marionette's kiss was vented directly into the Starfort's primary life support and atmospheric circulation system. The effect was not immediate, but it was absolute. In the medici bays, Iron Hands apothecaries treating the wounded simply stopped, their narthusiums hovering over open wounds. On the gun decks, tech marines performing the rites of maintenance went still, their hands resting on the casings of immense cannons. In the halls, the chapter serfs, chapter masters, and even the revered Iron Fathers in their command sanctums, one by one fell silent. Their movements ceased. Their eyes, both organic and bionic, took on a familiar placid emptiness. Stronos, locked in a brutal confrontation with the golem on the planet below, felt the change as a sudden total severing of his command link. The stream of tactical data, logistical updates, and vox chatter from the Iron Spire simply ceased. The fortress, his anchor in the storm, had gone dark. He did not know the cause, but a cold, logical certainty gripped him. He had been so focused on the enemy before him that he had failed to account for the serpent at his back. Arvalus Khan, driven by his blasphemous obsession, had just turned the Iron Hands' greatest strength, their fortress, their logic, their very brotherhood, into a weapon aimed at their own heart. The war for the Lyran Cordon became a maelstrom that consumed souls as voraciously as it consumed munitions. Beyond the grand strategic movements of fleets and the epic clashes of titans, the campaign ground down into a war of logistics and morale, and on both fronts, the Imperium was bleeding out. The sheer unprecedented nature of the enemy turned every engagement into a psychological nightmare, inflicting a toll that could not be measured in simple casualty figures. For the regiments of the Astra Militarum, shipped in from a dozen sectors to form the bulwark of the imperial defense, the war was a unique and personalized hell. These were men and women raised on tales of glorious last stands against monstrous aliens and gibbering demons. They were trained to fight the enemies of mankind. But nothing could prepare them for the silent walking dead of the Lyra sector. Akkadian shock trooper, his jaw set in a line of grim determination, could hold the line against a tide of charging orcs. But to level his laser gun at an advancing crowd of imperial citizens, at children with vacant eyes and old men with placid faces who did not scream or charge, but simply walked towards the guns, was an act that shattered the spirit. Regiments broke. On the besieged world of Damocles' Reach, the 88th Mordian Iron Guard, famed for their unshakable discipline, refused orders to fire upon a human wave of enslaved civilians. Their commander, Colonel Graves, stood on the trench line, watching the silent masses approach. He saw the faces of his own family in the crowd. In the end, he ordered his men to fix bayonets. They held the line with cold steel, a futile, bloody gesture against an endless tide. They were overwhelmed and torn apart, their last moments a cacophony of their own screams against the suffocating silence of their foe. Commissars executed soldiers for cowardice and hesitation by the hundred, but their bolt pistols could not staunch the hemorrhaging of morale. Entire platoons were found catatonic in their bunkers, their minds simply snapping under the strain of the atrocities they were forced to commit. The logistical cost was just as staggering. The cordon designed to contain the plague became a cage for the imperial forces. Supply lines that stretched across half the segmentum were the lifeblood of the war, and they were constantly under threat. Archon Vex, with a puppeteer's grace, would activate sleeper populations on seemingly secure worlds along these routes. A vital agri-world providing food for 1 million soldiers would suddenly fall silent, its entire population marching into the great Prometheum refineries, creating continent-spanning firestorms that blotted out the sun. A naval refueling station would have its crews steer the entire structure into the local star, taking 12 Imperial cruisers with them. Every shipment of munitions, every ration pack, every replacement soldier had to be paid for in blood and vigilance, Lord Inquisitor. Corda, from his command ship, the Emperor's Judgment, presided over this grim ledger of attrition. His days were a blur of impossible decisions. He reviewed picked feeds of guardsmen being swarmed, of naval ratings on captured ships being spaced without void suits by their former crewmates, their bodies freezing and shattering in the silent void. He read reports from his Ordo Hereticus agents about the rise of strange, nihilistic cults among the soldiery, men who had begun to worship the silence, seeing it as a release from the endless horror of the war. The ultimate tool of his command became the cyclonic torpedo, protocol, exterminatus, once the final unthinkable sanction became a standard tactical procedure. A world that was even suspected of contamination, a hive that showed the slightest sign of psychic quiet, was condemned. Corda would watch on a strategic display as the icon for a world like Sanctus IV, home to 30 billion souls, a bastion of the Imperial Creed, was targeted. He would give the final authorization, his voice a dead monotone, and then he would watch the icon turn from a loyal blue to a terminal red, signifying that its atmosphere had been ignited and its crust cracked open. He created fire breaks of dead, sterilized planets, sacrificing billions to save trillions. But with each world he condemned, another piece of his own soul felt as if it were being scoured away, leaving a void that mirrored the one he was fighting. The sheer scale of the death was numbing. Sector Command estimated that for every one of Vex's active combatants, the corrupted Skitarii, or the Chorus Golems, 10,000 enslaved civilians were expended as shields, diversions, or raw material. The Imperium was fighting an enemy that had a near infinite supply of ammunition, and that ammunition was the very citizenry the Imperium existed to protect. The war for the Lyra sector was no longer a crusade. It was a vast, protracted act of self-mutilation, and with every passing day the price of victory climbed to a height that made it indistinguishable from utter defeat. The silence of the Iron Spire was the event horizon from which no good news could escape. Cardan Stronos, his command structure decapitated and his own chapter turned into a fleet of silent steel puppets, was forced into a retreat that cost him half his remaining ground forces. The war for Cygnus Prime was lost. Magos Kane's treachery had not just crippled the Iron Hands, it had handed the most vital industrial world in the cordon to Archon Vex on a silver platter. Now the Archon had access to the Forge world's immense foundries, and the silent legions of tech priests and servitors began the obscene work of creating new, even more terrible war machines, guided by the artistic sadism of their Drukhari masters. The entire imperial strategy was in ruins. Aboard the Emperor's judgment, a council of war was convened in an atmosphere of utter despair. Lord Admiral de Vorn, her face etched with exhaustion, reported that her fleet was at 30% operational strength. Commodore Valerius presented casualty figures that ran into the billions. The representative of the Astra Militarum, Lord General Castor, spoke of whole armies on the verge of total collapse, his voice cracking with barely suppressed rage and grief. The cordon was failing. The silent Scourge, now bolstered by the might of a Forge world, was beginning to press outwards, and the fire breaks of dead worlds were not enough to hold it back. It was into this chamber of defeat that Lord Inquisitor Corda walked, his presence radiating a cold, dangerous intensity. He did not offer words of comfort or tactical reassurance. He laid a single alien artifact on the hololithic table, a shard of shimmering crystalline material that seemed to drink the light from the room. It was a fragment of the webway, recovered at immense cost by a team of his best agents from a long-dead Eldar world. "Our strategy is flawed," Corda stated, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the council. "We fight the artist's puppets, but we cannot reach the artist herself. We fight on her stage by her rules. This must end. We must take the war to her, into her realm." He outlined a plan born of absolute desperation. It was not a strategy. It was a suicide mission on a scale that dwarfed any single fleet action. Magos Khan, in his folly, had keyed his corrupted strain of the psychophage to a binaric signal. That signal, Corda's astropaths had discovered, had created a sympathetic resonance, a psychic echo within the greater network of the marionette's kiss. It was a flaw in the masterpiece, then a single discordant note. This echo, faint as it was, pointed back to the source, a stable nexus point deep within the chaotic, non-Euclidean hell of the Drukhari webway. It was a beacon that could, theoretically, be used for navigation. "We will assemble a strike fleet," Corda continued, his augmetic eye glowing with cold fire. "Small, elite, shielded to the highest possible degree. Its purpose will not be to engage the enemy's fleets, but to bypass them entirely. We will use the psychic resonance of the fallen Iron Spire as our lodestone. We will deliberately sail into the heart of the storm, allowing the psychophage's own network to guide us through the webway to its origin point, the Archon's fortress, what my cryptographers have designated the Theater of Whispers." The council erupted. To voluntarily enter the webway was madness. To do so without the guidance of the Eldar was to invite a fate worse than death. The ships would be lost, their crews driven insane, their very souls unmade by the labyrinthine energies of that alien dimension. It was Cardan Stronos, his voice broadcast from his battered command lander, who silenced them. The logic is sound, the Iron Butcher's synthesized voice grated through the chamber's speakers. A conventional war is now statistically unwinnable. The attrition rates are unsustainable. The only remaining variable for success is a high-risk, high-yield decapitation strike against the enemy command structure. There was a pause, a moment of uncharacteristic silence from the Iron Master. My chapter has been violated. My fortress has been defiled. My purpose has been made clear. The Iron Hands will spearhead this assault. I will personally tear the heart from this alien witch and bring it back as a trophy for our shame. The final component of Corda's desperate gambit was the most controversial. He had sent a priority summons not to the Space Marines or the Imperial Guard, but to the hidden fortress of the Grey Knights on Titan. The threat of the marionette's kiss was so esoteric, so tied to the soul and the energies of the immaterium, that it fell squarely within their sacred jurisdiction. One man, Brother Captain Arian of the Third Brotherhood, answered the call, arriving aboard a strike cruiser that moved through the warp like a silver ghost. He was a figure of awesome psychic power and unshakable faith, his silver Terminator armor covered in wards of protection. His mission was twofold: to provide the psychic shielding necessary to survive the voyage through the webway, and to hunt down and destroy the renegade Archmagos Valerius Kane, whose techno-heresy had now endangered the entire galaxy. And so the fleet was assembled. It was a small, grim collection of ships. The fastest cruisers from Devorn's battle group, the Iron Hands strike cruiser, Iron Will, and at its heart, the Grey Knight's vessel, the Blade of Titan. They gathered in the shadow of the now silent forge world of Cygnus Prime, a constant looming reminder of their failure. Their destination was not a star system or a planet, but a concept, the source of an alien psychic will. They prepared to sail into the realm of nightmares, guided by the psychic ghost of their own defeat, on a final desperate voyage into the heart of the silence. The voyage through the webway was a descent into profound unreality. Guided by the psychic resonance of the iron spire and shielded by the incandescent faith of the Grey Knights, the strike fleet plunged into a twisting phosphorescent tunnel of screaming alien architecture. Time and space lost all meaning. The crews of the Imperial vessels were confined to sanctified chambers, their helmet visors welded shut, listening to endless loops of devotional litanies to drown out the maddening whispers that bled through the hull. On the bridge of the Iron Will, Cardan Stronos and his Terminator elite stood bolted to the deck, their minds locked in a state of cold, logical meditation, the only way to resist the non-Euclidean chaos that raged outside their viewports. Their destination revealed itself not as a place, but as a wound, a festering nexus point where the clean, crystalline structure of the webway had been corrupted, twisted into a cancerous growth of singing crystal and weeping flesh-like material. This was the theater of whispers, Archon Malixia Vex's personal hell fief, a fortress built from psychic pain. The assault was instantaneous and brutal. There was no orbital bombardment, no protracted siege. The 3 Imperial ships burst from the webway directly into the heart of the theater, their guns blazing. They materialized in a vast cavernous dome, the sky of which was a swirling vortex of captured souls. Below them lay a grand amphitheater, its tiers filled not with spectators, but with countless victims held in stasis, their silent screams providing the fortress with its power and its name. At the center of this horrific arena, on a stage of polished bone, stood a throne of writhing living agony, and upon it sat the Maestra herself, Archon Melixia Vex. She had been waiting. Her Cabalite warriors, lithe and cruel figures in bladed armor, surged from hidden alcoves, their splinter rifles spitting a rain of poisoned shards. Grotesques and racks, hulking monstrosities of the Homunculi covens lumbered forward to meet the Imperial charge. The battle for the Theater of Whispers began. Thunderhawks and storm ravens screamed from the launch bays of the Imperial cruisers, their guns strafing the alien hordes. But the primary assault came from the Iron Will. In a maneuver of pure, spiteful aggression, Stronos ordered the ship's prow to ram directly into the central stage. The ancient vessel, a veteran of 1,000 battles, groaned in protest as it plowed through alien architecture, its armored beaks smashing the bone stage and coming to rest mere meters from the Archon's throne. The assault ramp slammed down, and Cardan Stronos emerged. He was a figure of black iron and cold fury, his Terminator armor scarred and pitted from the fighting on Cygnus Prime. In one hand he hefted his chain fist, Will of Medusa, its adamantium teeth already spinning with a hungry growl. In the other he carried a master-crafted storm bolter. Behind him, 2 full squads of Gorgon Terminators marched in his wake, a phalanx of silent, implacable death. Archon Vex rose from her throne, a cruel, appreciative smile on her perfect face. She was grace and sadism made flesh, wielding a slim, crackling agonizer whip and a wicked-looking venom blade. She did not seem like a commander, but a prima donna taking the stage for her final performance. "The Iron Butcher," she purred, her voice a melodic whisper that carried across the chaos of the battle, amplified by the theater's strange acoustics. "You have torn through my overture and crashed my first act. Such a brute, such a wonderfully direct and artless creature. Have you come for a private lesson in the aesthetics of pain?" Stronos did not answer with words. He raised his storm bolter and unleashed a torrent of explosive shells. Vex moved with impossible speed, a blur of motion that seemed to flow around the detonations, the force of the blasts merely tossing her long dark hair. Her incubi bodyguards, warriors clad in horned helmets and wielding colossal claves, were not so fortunate. They met the charge of the Gorgon Terminators head-on. The clash was a thunderous cacophony of ceramite against tempered steel. Claves that could slice through tank armor screeched against the impenetrable hides of the Iron Hands elite. The duel between the Maestra and the Butcher began. It was a clash of diametrically opposed philosophies of war. Vex was a whirlwind of elegant, precise strikes. Her agonizer whip lashed out, seeking the joints in Stronos' armor, every strike sending arcs of neurostatic agony that would have crippled a lesser warrior. She danced around him, her movements fluid and unpredictable, a fencer against a stone wall. Stronos, in contrast, was a bastion of pure, unyielding force. He did not dodge. He did not parry. He simply endured her attacks, his augmented physiology, and the sheer resilience of his Terminator plate absorbing the punishment. For every lash of her whip, he took a single ponderous step forward, his metal feet cracking the bone stage. His movements were economical, brutally simple. He was not trying to outmaneuver her. He was simply closing the distance, contracting the battlefield until there was nowhere left for her to dance. The Gorgon Terminators were a perfect reflection of their master. They fought with a cold, brutalist efficiency, weathering the storm of the incubi's elegant blows before responding with crushing hammer blows and the unstoppable grinding of their chain fists. Around the central duel, the wider battle raged. The Grey Knights, led by brother Captain Arian, had formed a psychic fortress, their storm bolters and nemesis force weapons purging the Drukhari warriors, while their combined will held the maddening influence of the realm at bay. They were the anchor of faith in a sea of damnation. Vex, realizing her light attacks were having little effect on the implacable giant before her, feinted with her whip and darted in close, her venom blade stabbing towards the single organic eye of the Iron Master. It was a move of blinding speed, a killing blow intended to end the duel with a flourish. Stronos did not flinch. He did not raise a hand to block. He simply tilted his head slightly. The poisoned tip of the blade scraped against the cold steel of his facial augmetics, showering sparks. He had anticipated the move, calculated the trajectory, and presented the machine, not the flesh. In that moment of her overextension, he had her. The will of Medusa roared to life. He did not swing it in a wide arc. It was a short, brutal, piston-like thrust, delivered with the full force of his Terminator armor's servos. The chain fist plunged into the Archon's midsection, its grinding teeth tearing through her elegant armor and the flesh beneath with a wet, sickening crunch. For a moment, there was silence between them. Vex looked down in genuine surprise, her perfect smile faltering for the first time. She looked up at the cold, impassive face of the Iron Butcher, half flesh, half machine. "There is no art in this," Stronos' voice rumbled from his vox grill, a sound like grinding stones. "There is only the logical application of overwhelming force. Your performance is concluded." He squeezed the trigger, and the chain fist's motor screamed as it tore her body asunder. The Maestro of Whispers, the architect of a sector's damnation, was ended not with a poetic flourish, but with the brutal, efficient finality of an industrial accident. In the instant of her profane apotheosis, as the chain fist tore her physical form to ribbons, Archon Melixia Vex unleashed her magnum opus. Her death was not an end but a crescendo. She threw her head back, and from the ruin of her throat she issued a single final note. It was not a scream of pain, but a psychic broadcast of pure, exultant agony and triumph, a death song amplified a trillionfold by the weeping architecture of the theater of whispers and the vortex of captured souls swirling above. This was her final curse, her ultimate masterpiece of suffering. The shriek ripped through the webway, traveling instantaneously along the psychic network of the marionette's kiss. It was a kill switch and a detonator all in one. Across the thousands of worlds and innumerable void stations of the Lyran Cordon and beyond, Every single being touched by the psychophage received the final command. On Cygnus Prime, the war ended in a heartbeat. The chorus golems, those titans of stitched-together flesh, simply stiffened. The low psychic thrumming that emanated from them rose to an unbearable silent shriek, and then they exploded. They did not detonate in a shower of gore, but imploded, the psychic energy holding them together reversing its polarity, crushing them into dense, screaming singularities of flesh that then vanished, leaving behind only vast glassy craters. The traitor Skitarii, the silent tech priests, the numberless legions of enslaved menials, in mid-stride, mid-shot, mid-task, they all just stopped. Their heads snapped back as if pulled by an invisible string. Their mouths opened in a universal silent O of agony, and they dropped. Not like men falling in battle, but like puppets whose strings had all been severed at once. They collapsed into heaps of lifeless meat, every single one, across the entire planet. Lord Admiral Devorn, watching from the bridge of the battered triumph of Sol, saw the lights of Cygnus Prime flicker and die. Auspex returns that had shown a world teeming with billions of life signs suddenly went flat. All across the sector, on every besieged world and contested station, the reports flooded in. The enemy was gone. The silent armies had fallen. The war was over. But there was no celebration on the Imperial command channels, only a stunned, horrified silence. Aboard the wreckage of the Theater of Whispers, the aftermath of the psychic death shriek was catastrophic. The fortress, powered by Vex's will and the agony of her victims, began to tear itself apart. The soul vortex above collapsed, unleashing a gale of screaming psychic energy. Crystalline structure shattered, and the very fabric of the pocket dimension began to unravel. "We are leaving, now." Brother Captain Arian's voice boomed through the Vox, a command laced with the irrefutable authority of his office. "This realm is collapsing into the raw immaterium." The surviving Imperial forces disengaged, fighting a desperate rearguard action against the now berserk remnants of Vex's cabal and the demonic entities that began to pour through the fresh tears in reality. They retreated back to their ships, the Gorgon Terminators forming an unbreachable wall of black iron around their master. Cardan Strono stood over the mangled remains of the Archon, his chain fist dripping with her alien blood. He had achieved his objective. The witch was dead. His cold, logical mind registered the mission as a success. Yet, as he watched the very reality of his surroundings dissolve into screaming chaos, he felt an unfamiliar sensation. It was not regret, not remorse, but the chilling understanding of the cost of his victory. He had been so focused on the logic of the decapitation strike that he had never once considered the consequence of succeeding. He was the last to board the Iron Will. As the assault ramp began to rise, he looked back at the disintegrating stage. He had come here seeking vengeance, seeking to purge the shame of his chapter's violation. He had found only a victory so absolute, so total, that it was indistinguishable from an act of genocide. He had not liberated the Lyra sector. He had merely executed it. The Imperial strike fleet tore itself free from the collapsing dimension, bursting back into the relative sanity of the webway with reality collapsing in their wake. Their journey back was a frantic, desperate flight, but they had won. They had struck off the head of the serpent. The marionette's kiss was broken. The cost was a sector of the dead, trillions of souls across hundreds of worlds, snuffed out in the same silent instant. They had been victims when they were enslaved, and they were victims again in their liberation. There were no victory parades, no joyous celebrations. The war had been won, but there was no one left to welcome the victors home. The silent scourge had been purged, but it had taken the entire Lyra sector with it into oblivion. The victory was perfect, and in its perfection, it was the most profound and devastating defeat the Segmentum Pacificus had ever known. The return of the strike fleet was not a triumphant arrival, but a ghostly emergence into a realm of tombs. As the Blade of Titan and its escorts translated back into real space at the Mandeville point of the Lyra system, they were met not by an honor guard or a cheering armada, but by the oppressive, suffocating silence they had fought so hard to create. Lord Admiral Devorn's fleet was still there, its ships hanging like steel vultures in the void, their running lights seeming unnaturally bright against the backdrop of the dead world of Lyra Magna. There were no hails, no requests for a situation report. Everyone knew. The astropaths who had survived the psychic death shriek of the Archon had felt the cataclysm, a wave of psychic nullity, the final exhalation of trillions of souls vanishing at once. It had left a permanent scar on the warp, a region of dead calm that navigators would shun for millennia to come. Lord Inquisitor Corda convened a final council, not in a grand strategium, but in the sterile Mechanicus bay of the Emperor's judgment. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and sterilized fluid. Here, the true cost of the victory was laid bare. On one plasteel slab lay the grievously wounded form of Cardan Stronos. He had killed the Archon, but not before her death throes, and the subsequent collapse of her fortress had shattered his terminator plate and broken his augmented body. His one organic eye was closed, his breathing a ragged mechanical hiss. The Iron Butcher had paid a heavy price for his vengeance. On another slab, cloaked in stasis, was the prize brought back by Brother Captain Arian, not Valerius Kane, but the renegade Magos' primary research engine, a terrifying cogitator abomination of flesh and crystal. Kane himself had foreseen the collapse of the theater and had used the chaos to slip away deeper into the webway, a new and terrible threat to be hunted another day. The engine, however, contained every iota of his blasphemous research, every last note on his attempts to perfect the marionette's kiss. It was a poisoned chalice of forbidden knowledge that Arian now presented to Corda. "The war is won, Inquisitor," the Grey Knight stated, his voice devoid of triumph. His silver armor was blackened and scored, but his presence was as indomitable as ever. "The alien is dead. The contagion is purged." He gestured to the cogitator. "But the idea remains. This knowledge is too dangerous to exist. It must be destroyed." Corda looked from the broken form of Stronos to the profane machine. He was the architect of this victory, the man who had authorized the final desperate gambit. Now he was left to preside over the wreckage. "Destruction is a temporary solution, Brother Captain," Corda replied, his voice weary beyond his years. "Ideas are not so easily killed. We must understand it, catalog its weaknesses, and prepare for the inevitable day when a mind like Kane's attempts this again." That echo of ruin was not just psychic, it was logistical, demographic, and spiritual. The Lyra sector, once a bustling hub of industry and faith, was now a silent expanse of ghost worlds. Survey teams sent down to Lyra Magna, Viridia 3, and 100 other planets sent back the same haunting reports. The cities were pristine, untouched by war. The infrastructure was intact, but the people were all dead, lying where they had fallen in the final, silent convulsion. They lay in the streets, in their hab blocks, at their factory stations, a silent testament to the scale of the cataclysm. There was no one to liberate, no one to rebuild. The sector was a perfectly preserved corpse. The task that fell to Corda and the remnants of the Imperial Command was monumental and soul-crushing. They were no longer generals, but morticians for an entire sector of space. Fleets were repurposed from combat patrols to quarantine enforcement. Regiments of the Imperial Guard, their minds already fragile from the horrors of the war, were now tasked with the grim duty of cataloging the dead and overseeing the mass incineration of trillions of bodies to prevent pestilence. It was a thankless, sanity-destroying job that would take decades. The shattered front lines dissolved not into celebration, but into a slow, grim process of redeployment. Battle-weary ships limped back to distant naval yards, their crews forever marked by what they had seen and done. The survivors spoke in hushed tones of the silent war, a campaign where the greatest victory was the greatest atrocity. The legend of the Iron Butcher became a cautionary tale, a story of a hero whose methods were so monstrous he had become indistinguishable from the evil he fought. The Imperium had faced an enemy that turned its own people into a weapon, and in the end, the only winning move had been to destroy the weapon and the people together. The echo of that ruin would resonate through the annals of the Ordozinos forever, a stark reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, some victories leave scars deeper than any defeat. In the antechamber of a starless dimension, far from the light of Terra and the crude, visceral reality of the recent war, a new performance was being considered. This was not the gaudy, overwrought theater of whispers, with its singing crystals and operatic flourishes. This was a laboratory, a place of sterile, dispassionate science, where pain was not an art form, but a resource to be measured, refined, and distilled. This was the heart of the coven of the unmarred visage, the domain of the master homunculus, Uriax. Uriax was an ancient and terrible being, a creature who had long since sculpted himself beyond the base form of the Drukhari. He was a pillar of pale, stitched-together flesh, his face a smooth, unblemished mask of skin from which a dozen metallic, multi-jointed arms sprouted, each ending in a dizzying array of scalpels, injectors, and sensory probes. He did not watch the events in the Lyra sector on a crystalline stage, but as a silent, cascading waterfall of data scrolling down obsidian monoliths that filled his sanctum. He observed psychic resonance, mortality quotients, neurological responses, and rates of contagion with the detached interest of a biologist studying a petri dish. Archon Malixia Vex had been a useful instrument, passionate, flamboyant, and utterly predictable. She had believed the marionette's kiss was her masterpiece, her grand contribution to the art of suffering. Uriax knew better. The psychophage was his creation, a crude first draft prototype that he had gifted to the ambitious Archon, along with the cadre of his apprentice homunculi. Her entire war, her sector-spanning performance, had been nothing more than a field test, a grand, bloody, and exquisitely well-documented experiment. He had watched Stronos' brutal tactics, the Inquisitor's desperate gambits, and the Grey Knight's psychic intervention with clinical detachment. He recorded how the plague reacted to Astartes' psycho-conditioning, how it was affected by Imperial psychic shielding, how its command network could be subverted by a sufficiently talented, if foolish, human technomancer. Every Imperial countermeasure, every act of defiance, had simply provided him with more data, highlighting the weaknesses and limitations of his initial design. Vex's defeat was not a failure. It was the final, crucial data point. As the death shriek of the Archon echoed through his laboratory, as a spike on a graph, Uriax's many arms moved with a sudden, deliberate purpose. He had seen the flaw. Vex's control system was too centralized, too dependent on her own theatrical, ego-driven will. Her death had unraveled the entire network. It was an inefficient, if dramatic, design. One of his metallic claws plucked a pulsating gelatinous sac from a nutrient bath. Within it, a new strain of the psychophage swirled, a milky, ethereal substance that seemed to writhe with the malevolent intelligence of its own. This was version 2.0, the marionette's kiss, refined and perfected. This new strain was decentralized. It no longer required a single maestra to conduct the chorus. Instead, it operated like a true virus, a mimetic plague that would turn every infected mind into a new node in an ever-expanding network. It would be self-replicating, self-perpetuating, and utterly impossible to decapitate. Killing one host would only strengthen the resolve of the others in their local cluster. Furthermore, it no longer merely unplugged the soul. His apprentices, under his remote guidance, had learned much from their flesh crafting on Cygnus Prime. The new kiss would not just sever the soul, it would harvest it. On another obsidian monolith, a new counter began to tick upwards with astonishing speed. The trillions of souls released in Vex's final scream had not simply dissipated into the warp. Her fortress, by Uriax's design, had acted as a crude psychic funnel. The immense spiritual energy of the dead, of the Lyra sector, a torrent of psychic potential that could have started a new warp storm, was being siphoned, captured, and piped directly into the storage crypts of the Coven of the Unmarred Visage. Uriax turned his smooth, featureless face towards a vast crystalline vat that now glowed with the captured light of a dying galaxy. He had what he needed, the refined formula for a plague that could not be stopped, and the raw spiritual power of an entire sector of humanity to fuel its launch. Vex's performance had been a cacophonous, brutish affair, a war fought with blunt instruments like chorus golems and enslaved armies. It had been loud, messy, and ultimately a failure. The patron, however, was pleased with the data it had provided. His own composition would be far more subtle. It would not be a war. It would be a gradual replacement, a quiet, creeping tide of silence that would spread from world to world, not with fleets and armies, but on the breath of a merchant, in the cargo hold of a freighter, in the mind of a lonely astropath. The applause for Melixia Vex's tragedy was the quiet hum of Uriax's laboratory coming to life. Her war had set the stage, and now, with the knowledge gained and the power harvested, the true artist was ready to begin. The whispers of a new war were not whispers at all. They were the silent, patient ticking of a doomsday clock that the Imperium did not even know existed. In the centuries that followed the Silent War, the Lyra sector was officially struck from all Imperial star charts, its designation replaced with a chilling new title, Sector Silentium. It became a byword for a graveyard, a cursed region of space that naval captains would divert entire fleets to avoid. But the Imperium, in its vast, grinding, and often callous way, abhors a vacuum. Worlds, especially those with intact, high-functioning infrastructure, are too valuable an asset to be left fallow, no matter how haunted they may be. The order came down from the High Lords of Terra, a decree known as the Edict of Resettlement. It was a task of monumental, almost unthinkable scale, the repopulation of the dead sector. The project was handed to the Adeptus Administratum and the Departamento Munitorum, who approached it not as a reclamation of a lost home, but as the largest logistical exercise in the segmentum's history. From the overpopulated, underemployed hive worlds of the segmentum obscurus and the destitute populations of systems ravaged by other wars, the great resettlement fleets were launched. Colossal transport ships, vessels the size of small moons that had once carried entire armies to war, were now filled to bursting with billions of colonists. These were the dispossessed, the hopeful, the desperate, and the damned, lured by promises of free land, prosperous futures, and a chance to escape the squalor of their former lives. They were not told the full truth of their destination. They were told only that they were pioneers, rebuilding a sector that had suffered a catastrophic plague, now long since purged. The arrival of the first colonists on worlds like Lyra Magna was a profoundly unsettling experience. They disembarked not onto a blasted wasteland or a primitive frontier, but into cities of breathtaking scale and complexity, all utterly pristine and utterly empty. They walked through plazas designed for millions, where the only sound was the echo of their own footsteps. They were assigned hab units that were still furnished. The previous owner's personal effects left exactly where they had been dropped in that final silent moment. Food replicators still held half-eaten meals. Data slates lay open on desks. Children's toys were scattered on the floors of silent playrooms. They were living in the homes of ghosts, sleeping in their beds, working at their factory stations. Every colonist was acutely, uncomfortably aware that they were walking on a planet-sized tomb. The administratum scribes had tried to sterilize the history, referring to the previous inhabitants as the departed, but the sheer, oppressive weight of their absence could not be erased. Whispers and superstitions grew like weeds in the silent cities. Colonists claimed to hear faint, whispering voices on the wind at night. Others swore they saw fleeting, spectral figures in their peripheral vision, silent onlookers from another world. Hab blocks an entire city. Districts were declared haunted and abandoned, becoming no-go zones where only the desperate or the insane would venture. A strange, pervasive melancholia settled over the new populations, a spiritual malaise that no amount of sanctioned hymn-singing or commissariat propaganda could dispel. Suicide rates in Sector Silentium were 5 times the segmentum average. The Adeptus Ministorum worked tirelessly to combat the gloom, reconsecrating every street and sanctifying every home. Great cathedrals were raised on the sites of the worst silent mass deaths, their bells pealing day and night in a futile attempt to fill the oppressive silence. The Adeptus Mechanicus, under strict inquisitorial supervision, reactivated the forges of Cygnus Prime, but the tech priests who walked its corridors reported strange ghost signals in the noosphere, faint data echoes of the world's last moments of corrupted unity. The new generations born in Sector Silentium were a strange and somber people. They were known for their quiet demeanor, their fatalistic outlook, and their deep-seated distrust of silence. They filled their lives with constant noise, from endless musical broadcasts to the ceaseless clang of industry, anything to keep the terrifying stillness at bay. They were pioneers living in a second-hand future, forever in the shadow of the trillions who had perished without a sound. The Imperium had successfully refilled the empty vessel of the Lyra sector, but the wine it now held was tainted with a sorrow and a horror that would never wash away. The resettlement was a logistical triumph, a testament to the Imperium's unyielding will, but it had created a sector of haunted souls, a permanent living memorial to the war that must never be spoken of. The Silent War, though stricken from official imperial histories and relegated to the most highly classified archives of the Inquisition, left a legacy written in scars across the galaxy. It did not shift the great balance of power in a way that star charts could measure, but it carved deep, psychological wounds into the institutions that had prosecuted it, changing them in subtle yet permanent ways. Cardan Stronos, the Iron Butcher of Cygnus, was eventually rebuilt by the finest artisans of the Adeptus Mechanicus. His body, now more machine than ever, was a testament to the art of bionics, stronger and more resilient than before. Yet something within him had been fundamentally altered. He returned to the Iron Hands not as a celebrated victor, but as a grim and solitary figure. The logic that had been his shield and his sword now offered no comfort. He had followed the calculus of war to its ultimate conclusion and found it hollow. He had committed the perfect atrocity to achieve the perfect victory, and the equation had balanced, but the result was a profound and aching nullity. He became a legend, a name whispered with awe by his battle brothers, but it was the legend of a flawlessly efficient weapon, not a leader of men. He had saved his chapter's honor by sacrificing a sector, and the silent weight of those trillions of dead souls would follow him for the rest of his long, bitter existence. In the hallowed halls of the Inquisition, the ramifications of the marionette's kiss were felt for centuries. Lord Inquisitor Valerius Kane, haunted by the ghosts of the worlds he had condemned to exterminatus, dedicated the remainder of his life to ensuring such a catastrophe could never happen again. He presented his findings to a secret conclave of his most trusted peers, arguing that the ordos of the Inquisition were ill-equipped to combat threats that targeted the very essence of human consciousness. The Ordo Xenos fought the alien, the Ordo Malleus the demon, and the Ordo Hereticus the traitor, but none were prepared for a war against the soul itself. His advocacy led to the secret founding of a new esoteric chamber, the Ordo Animabus. Its purpose was singular and terrifying, to study the nature of the human soul as a quantifiable and therefore corruptible resource. Its inquisitors were scholars and metaphysicians as much as warriors, tasked with hunting down esoteric psychic contagions and understanding the horrifying new ways the enemies of man had devised to unmake them from within. The legacy of Archmagos Valerius Kane became a cautionary tale of the highest order within the Adeptus Mechanicus. His name was expunged from all records. His research declared the ultimate techno-heresy. The very concept of melding Xenos bioweaponry with the holy technologies of the machine god was a blasphemy that sent shivers of revulsion through even the most radical magi. Yet his work, a perfect synthesis of biological and informational warfare, secretly fascinated many. In the dark, hidden laboratories of Styges VIII and the ostracized covens of the logic-obsessed, whispers of his final thesis on perfecting humanity became an underground text, a source of terrible and alluring temptation. The hunt for Kane himself became a shadow war waged by the Grey Knights and the Ordo Animabus, a silent, desperate race to find him before he could unleash his perfected plague upon an unsuspecting galaxy. But the greatest legacy of the Silent War was the silence itself. The story of the marionette's kiss became a ghost story, a whispered myth told by naval voidsmen and Astra Militarum veterans on long, lonely vigils. They spoke of entire worlds falling without a single shot fired, of heroes who had to become monsters to win, and of a victory that felt like the end of the world. It was a chilling reminder, even in a galaxy defined by unending war and unimaginable horror, that there were fates far worse than a glorious death in battle. The most terrifying enemy was not the one that charged screaming at the gates, but the one that crept in silently, stole the soul, and left behind an empty, obedient shell. The war had ended, the dead were buried, and the worlds were repopulated, but the fear born from that conflict, the fear of a silent, soulless imperium, became another permanent shadow in the grim darkness of the far future.